It's hard to fathom how my life has turned into a nightmare in just 4 years. 4 years back, my wife started working at Gilbert Endeavors. Our kids were teenagers, and Emily was eager to leave home. Back then, an entry-level secretarial position seemed perfect. My name is Lane Trexler. My real name is Austin, but I've always been called Lane. I had a wiry build, standing at an average height and weighing less than 140 pounds when I graduated from high school. I was never interested in sports, particularly the competitive ones. The closest I came to anything sporting was long-range shooting. Throughout high school and college, I spent most of my non-academic time either shooting or reloading. After 8 years, I could consistently hit a 2-inch target at 100 yards. My favorite gun was the Marlin 336C because of the caliber cartridge. This cartridge has been out of production for many years, but I have made my own from 30 to 30 shells with the neck facing down. Success in something like this gave me a sense of pride and achievement that I desperately needed. During my college years, 2 significant events occurred. I met my wife Emily and my future business partner, Paul Fuller. Aside from that, college was a bit dull. I earned a degree in geology, got married, and launched a small surveying business with Paul. Life was good. Paul and I never worked for anyone else. After college, we each invested $2,500 to start our own small surveying company. We focused on small jobs and high volumes of real estate sales. While we didn't make a lot of money, we were comfortable and happy. Paul married a local girl 3 months after Emily, and I tied the knot. My family owned a hut we referred to as a bungalow in Schuylkill County, situated on 160 acres. During my younger years, we used it for all our family gatherings. In contrast, the Fullers had a real cabin on 640 acres in Potter County. Paul and his family only used it for hunting. That's all you need to know for now. As I mentioned, my life began to fall apart about 4 years ago. Gilbert Endeavors, a company that designed and manufactured trainers, had its headquarters nearby, with manufacturing plants and distribution centers spread across the country. My wife, Emily, took a job there when our twin daughters, Marcy and Mercy, started high school. Initially, it seemed like a great opportunity. The hours were reasonable, the pay was fair, and the location was convenient. For the first year or so, everything was perfect. GE brought Zane Baker, a retired NFL quarterback, on board as the marketing manager and company spokesman. Unfortunately, my wife was part of the marketing department. For half a year, we were bombarded with tales of the incredible Zane Baker. My wife and daughters were infatuated with his greatness. Thankfully, the admiration appeared to wane after about 6 months, coinciding with Emily starting to work overtime. Paul and I both grew up in the area, so we were familiar with many people who worked in Gilbert. It wasn't hard to discover that Emily and Zane Baker had started dating. While their relationship flourished, our marriage fell apart. As Emily and I drifted apart, my bond with my daughters also weakened. I never mentioned this to her. She started traveling more frequently for business and promotional trips. I faded into the background. Usually, though not always, she would invite me to parties and gatherings where I would be ignored for the remainder of the evening. Sex was entirely off the table. How can anyone endure such a life? Our family life was normal until Emily started working. We would go on family outings on weekends and take vacations at least once a year. The girls participated in ballet lessons and played football. Emily was involved in the PTA and Scouts. We had a weekly pizza night. The only thing the girls didn't enjoy was spending time in the bungalow. But all that is in the past now. Everything has vanished. Over the past few years, Emily has attended more conference retreats and meetings. Recently, for some of her longer trips, she has taken the girls along. I was neither invited nor asked if I wanted to join. I'd often overheard the girls telling their friends about the great time they had, but they never mentioned anything when they knew I was nearby. Zane Baker was never brought up, even though I knew he accompanied them on every walk. At Gilbert's New Year's party, everything fell into place. Emily found it hard not to invite me, even though I didn't want to go. The humiliation of living with infidelity was bad enough on its own. I feared I wouldn't be able to control myself if things got out of hand. And I was right. All the girls were dressed to the nines. Marcy and Mercy were particularly excited, as it was their first adult party. Without a tuxedo, I simply wore the best suit I had. When we arrived, several hundred people were already milling around. Lane Trexler, Glad to see what you came up with. Thank you for bringing your wife and beautiful daughters to our little gathering. Zane Baker seemed to take pleasure in the grimace on my face as he squeezed my hand. When he finally let go, I caught Emily smirking. The girls looked at me with disgust and quickly departed. It was the beginning of a bad evening. I nursed a single glass of beer and hid in a corner, trying not to further embarrass my wife and daughters. Despite my silence and inaction, I had already managed to spoil the start of their evening. Zane Baker was a big guy, really big. He stood at least a foot taller than me and weighed 100 pounds more, all muscle. He was the embodiment of a happy hand and a platform. My daughters crowded around the room, while my wife spent almost the entire evening next to him. She held his hand lightly most of the time. Several people at lower levels made feeble attempts to engage in conversation with me. Mid and senior level managers noticed me, smirking or making sly remarks to their comrades that I felt were related to my cuckold status. I didn't hear any words, but it was clear what was happening. My beer was replaced with a simple ginger ale, which I sipped slowly. I usually prided myself on being well in control and never losing my composure. Many people began dancing, and I noticed the girls were enjoying themselves, as was my wife. Naturally, with Baker. In the past 3 hours, neither she nor the girls had spoken to me once. Off to the side of the dance floor, a small group of men and women were chatting when one of the guys pointed at Emily and Baker. They glanced in my direction, started laughing, and walked away when they saw me looking. A few minutes later, they were still giggling. That marked the end of my evening. I set my glass down and headed towards the door, noticing Baker's hands on my wife's ass while she caressed the back of his head. Before I knew it, she was pulling his head down and getting him a big, sloppy kiss right in the middle of the dance floor. It took me less than 5 seconds to cross the room, spin Baker around, and hit him as hard as I could with a roundhouse right. My arm hurt like hell, and the next thing I knew, I was waking up in the back of an ambulance. It was only a few minutes' drive to the emergency hospital, and I noticed I was the only one in the ambulance. I remembered being wheeled into the emergency room. The next thing I recall is waking up in some kind of recovery zone. Half an hour later, a doctor visited me to give the latest news on my condition. Besides the broken arm, I had 3 broken ribs, a broken nose, 3 knocked out teeth, and 2 loose ones. My jaw was clamped with wire, and my right kidney was bruised. Baker finished it off with a good blow to the testicles, causing several blood vessels to be damaged. The doctor mentioned that I could be discharged in about 4 days, but I would need to spend at least 2 weeks in rehab. They offered to arrange for me to undergo rehabilitation at home if I preferred. I opted for the first option. By the time my wife and daughters finally arrived, it was already late afternoon. Emily appeared annoyed, and the girls seemed bored. No one said a word. With my jaw feeling tense, I was hesitant to initiate any conversation. I could speak, but I didn't want her to realize that. "Well, Lane, what can you say in your defense?" I quickly gauged her mood and realized I didn't want to engage in this conversation. Instead of responding, I just mumbled and pointed at my jaw. We must have sat there in silence for a good minute before she spoke again. "I was embarrassed, Lane. The girls were so humiliated that we had to leave before the new year. The whole evening was ruined, and for what? I should have known what it would be like to take you out in public. I guarantee that nothing like this will happen again." She had no idea how right she was. I simply sat and looked at her, unable to even muster a smile, so I did nothing. They lingered for several minutes, but since I didn't react, they eventually got up and left. A couple of hours later, Paul showed up. We chatted for a few minutes. Yes, I could talk. Then he pulled out the local newspaper. I had made it to the front page. "Local NFL hero defends wife and daughters from cruel father," it read. The attached story described how I had attacked my wife while she was dancing at the annual Gilbert Endeavors New Year's Eve party. Zane Baker had burst into the room and held me until they took me away. Not exactly as I remembered it, but it's a story people will believe. Paul and I conversed for a few hours, exploring various options. Once he departed, I declined dinner and requested sleeping pills, needing a substantial rest. The following day was largely consumed by examinations, tests, and treatments. All issues were identified and necessary actions were implemented. Now, my only task was to wait and recover. A hospital staff member provided me with a list of suggested rehab centers in the vicinity. I selected one located near Hamburg. Paul arrived later that evening. I sold him my share of the company for $2,500. The handshake, of course, was the most crucial part of the deal. While I remained a co-owner, it wasn't documented on paper. All good things come in time. We chuckled at the irony that a week in rehab cost $2,500. Emily and the girls never saw me again at the hospital. They actually returned the day after I moved into rehab and were quite annoyed that they hadn't been informed. They were furious when they came to rehab and were denied access. Apparently, I had the option to specify who could visit me when I logged in. One of the orderlies mentioned that they were trying to see me. My ribs hurt like hell when I laughed. The most challenging aspect of my injuries ended up being the dental work. Fortunately, they had a dentist available on site for a certain fee, so I decided to take advantage of this service. The wound on my hand wasn't as serious as initially believed. Even though I had the chance to leave rehab a bit earlier, I chose to stay for the full 2 weeks. 10 days later, I could finally breathe deeply again. It felt nice. Emily never attempted to visit me again. The National CrossFit Show took place in Atlantic City on the second weekend of February. Emily and the girls attended, along with Zane Baker and the GE marketing team. Meanwhile, Paul and several of our employees spent the weekend relocating my clothes and belongings to a bungalow in Schuylkill County. He ensured my Marlin and all my reloading supplies were moved as well. 2 days later, I was settled into my new home. That weekend, Paul and his wife June came to visit. It seemed that Emily had been looking for me in the office. There had been no bank deposits into the joint account since the start of the year, and Emily demanded an explanation. Paul spent half an hour attempting to explain to her that not only did I no longer own part of the company, but I also didn't even work there. In a fit of desperation, she ran out, threatening to meet with the lawyer. After a couple of weeks, I was functioning quite normally. I did therapy and exercise as directed. Paul left me with one of the company trucks and a credit card. I also took a large amount of cash with me in case I needed it. I left my phone with Paul. The bungalow was cozy, but only temporary. I walked a bit and started jogging leisurely. Zane Baker lived in a large house on Doria Street, just outside of town. The road leading up Mount Penn was long and winding, making it a challenging place to build due to the steep mountainside. Despite this, finding the house wasn't hard, and I managed to locate some good, secluded vantage points. Every morning, I exercised to stay in shape. After lunch, I practiced target shooting, focusing on inanimate targets. My Bushnell laser rangefinder indicated that I needed to be accurate at 133 yards. My goal was to consistently hit an egg from that distance. I bought a lot of eggs and a muffler. I spent my evenings planning, adjusting, and recharging. I also started growing a beard. Paul visited me roughly every 2 weeks. Emily frequently stopped by the office, still searching for me. After 2 months, she finally gave up. Each time Paul came, he brought along a few newspaper clippings. It turns out my wife and daughters were continuing to enjoy the high life with their new benefactor. He must have been fully supported by them because I wasn't doing anything. Oddly enough, Emily and the girls were still living in our old house, which baffled me. It's time to move on. I began heading back into town early in the morning to secure a good vantage point to watch Zane's house. Swimming had become second nature to me. I never expected such a big guy to be a swimmer, but he did 50 laps every morning. Naturally, the pool was heated. That weekend, I traveled to Potter County. The transition from a bungalow to a hut was very welcome. There was no electricity, no running water, and no cell phone signal. The nearest Walmart was a 45-minute drive away in Olean, New York. I didn't want to go in winter, so I planned to wait for the next 4 months at least. If I forgot something or needed anything, I could get it before the bad weather shut me out. Early Wednesday morning, I drove to the office and transferred all my belongings from the truck into my Subaru Outback. I parked the company truck at a construction site at the base of the mountain and climbed to my chosen vantage point. At this early hour, there were no other cars around. I set up a tripod. I had 1 round in the chamber, 1 in the 2, and 2 more at the ready. 20 minutes later, Zane Baker went out for his morning swim. The first shot shattered his right ankle. Even with a muffler, it was very noisy this early. 2 seconds later, his left knee exploded. I loaded the next 2 rounds and took out his left elbow. My final target was his right wrist, but I couldn't aim at it due to his erratic movements, so I quickly gathered my weapon and left quietly. 10 minutes later, I left the construction site and headed back to the office where the Subaru was waiting for me. Instead of returning to the bungalow, I drove straight to Potter County. My first task was to clean the water source to ensure I had fresh water. Next, I began gathering a substantial supply of firewood. Fortunately, the cabin was watertight and well insulated. The LED lights I had were far superior and more cost-effective than the old carbon oil lamps previously used. Before long, everything was running smoothly, and I resumed shooting, this time aiming at paper targets. In the middle of the second week, I saw her for the first time. A tall, lanky woman dressed in jeans, a flannel shirt, and a vest. Even from a distance, I could tell she had a backpack or something similar on her back. She walked along an old logging trail that bordered an open area used as a shooting range. Despite having 640 acres, I still had no personal life. Naturally, it was more practical to construct a hut near the road where materials could be easily transported. One day, when the chance arose, I aimed at her. A complex crossbow was slung over her shoulder. I had no clue what she intended to do with it, but my curiosity was piqued. There was a small fire pit BBQ area on the stove, so I decided to bring an old galvanized coffee pot and some cookies. Yes, I bake really good cookies. It felt like I was setting some kind of trap. 3 days later, my trap succeeded. "I'm sorry, my name is Gianna. I hope we can talk." Her sudden approach caught me off guard. I stammered slightly, and he gestured for her to take a seat. "Would you like some coffee?" I'd offered, trying my best. She nodded, smiled, and set her crossbow down before sitting. "My name is Lane. I arrived here about 2 weeks ago. I've spotted you in this area a few times. I'm staying at a lodge about a mile from here. I try to go every day and usually end up here," I said, handing her one of my famous cookies. "Will you stay here long?" "I'll stay here until the end of the summer. And you?" "At least 4 or 5 months." She appeared to enjoy my cookies, though I sensed she might have preferred her coffee with cream and sugar. She didn't mention it, but I just somehow picked up on it. "No, not really. I used to shoot a little, but I haven't done anything for years. Right now I'm just doing some target shooting." "I hope I'm not being a bother, but would it be all right if I used this shooting range for some practice? I haven't been able to find a suitable place to use my bow." Her accent was difficult to pinpoint, perhaps English, Australian, or Scottish, but I didn't want to ask. "No, not at all. I think we could find something suitable for targeted support. Feel free to use it anytime." She ate the second cookie. I felt great. "I'm just curious. I thought most people use compound bows these days. You have a recurve bow, and it looks new." "Take my word for it, his recursion is better." She always carried 4 hunting arrows mounted on a bow, though she used simple arrows for target shooting. That evening, I drove several miles down the road and picked up 3 bales of hay. This marked the start of my summer with Gianna Paul. Gianna visited every day and went back to her house each evening. The lodge staff had a tracker on her cell phone, ensuring they always knew her location. At the start of our second week, a powerful summer squall struck. We gathered on the porch of the cabin, laughing and teasing her about her predicament. Without a word, she pulled out her phone and called the lodge. "Due to the weather, I won't be able to return this evening," she said, "but I found a comfortable place to stay for the night." I was both surprised and delighted. This marked the transition of my platonic relationship with Gianna Paul into an intimate one. From that moment on, we alternated our sleeping arrangements. Highlands Lodge stood out starkly in Potter County. It was a luxurious and costly retreat, attracting guests primarily from overseas. Gianna's family hailed from Cornwall. The lodge offered hot showers, abundant food, and laundry services, all of which I eagerly utilized. Outdoor sex is thrilling, but it's far better when you have all the amenities. Gradually, we spent less time at the shooting range. A couple of weeks later, as Gianna and I were enjoying lunch, Paul and June showed up. June appeared particularly happy that I had someone with me, and her delight grew when she saw it was a serious relationship. For the first few hours, we kept things low-key, but eventually, June and Gianna went off to have a conversation. After the tragic attack on Zane Baker, I became the first suspect. This turned out to be a much bigger problem for Zane than he expected. The press wanted to know why I was the main target of interest. The more they looked into it, the worse it became for Zane and my wife. Although the focus was on finding me, the press quickly turned to the relationship between Zane and my wife. 3 weeks later, Zane Baker was no longer representing Gilbert Endeavors. When the police visited the Schuylkill County bungalow, they found it empty. They had no leads from credit cards, no phone calls, and no clue about my whereabouts. They never questioned Paul about the cabin. Paul mentioned that Emily had come to the office several times, desperately trying to find out where I was as her source of money began to dwindle. According to Paul, Zane had lost interest in her and blamed her for his problems. I didn't have a plan for the next step. Going back wasn't an option, and I had no other alternatives. The urge to explore tugged at me. At that moment, I was drifting. As the year drew to a close, complacency began to settle in. I was happy and content with Gianna, but I should have focused more on my real life. It was a cool autumn day, and I found myself alone in the hut. Something felt off, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. I had just heated up the wood stove and made coffee when the door suddenly swung open. Zane Baker appeared, just as big and ugly as the last time I saw him. He stood there with a wide smile on his face and an old police SWAT pistol in his right hand. He seemed unsteady, holding his left arm at an odd angle, as if trying to maintain his balance. We simply stood and looked at each other. I anticipated some profound words of revenge, but none came. "I know it was you. You sneaky little weasel. Your wife mentioned that you did a lot of target shooting. I hope there's 911 here because it's going to be necessary." As he spoke, his face grew swollen and red, and he seemed to be working himself into a rage. Suddenly, a look of shock crossed his face. He dropped the gun and collapsed to one knee. Zane Baker rolled over on the floor, howling at the top of his lungs. A crossbow bolt, about 12 inches long, protruded from his left buttock, with the remaining 6 inches buried deep and firmly. Gianna stood in the doorway smiling. We nearly sprinted the entire way back to the Highlands. I left everything behind at the cabin. Gianna spent around 15 minutes packing all her stuff into the rented Land Rover. Throughout the process, we laughed like a pair of high school kids. By the time we hit US 80, we had settled into a more normal state. Breakfast was both comforting and filling. "I don't think so. You should call 911. I shot him with one of the 3-bladed hunting arrows. It needs to be cut out. She can't be pulled out. He will likely have to lie on his stomach on a gurney when he goes to the emergency room. This must be awkward." "Well, Miss Gianna, looks like we're in big trouble now, and it's all your fault." She flicked a fork full of scrambled eggs and laughed. Once breakfast was over, I got in touch with Paul, and Gianna made a call to someone else. I filled Paul in on the situation, and he seemed to find it amusing. I mentioned that we were heading to Ocala, Florida, where my grandparents lived, which made him chuckle because he knew I was just covering for him. While I was still on the phone, Gianna came over and took my wallet out of my pocket. She went back to her seat and resumed the conversation as I picked up some treats for our journey. Although I was clueless about our destination, I had a sense that Gianna had everything figured out. She kept her plans to herself, and I didn't press for details. My ignorance was bliss, and I trusted her completely. It had been a long day, and we eventually arrived at a charming bed and breakfast nestled in the Wisconsin valleys. Worn out from the drive, we quickly drifted off to sleep. I got a new wardrobe, and Gianna picked up a big bag of snacks. Ever since I was a boy, I had dreamed of canoeing on the lakes, and finally, I managed to make it happen. Everything was arranged when we arrived. The outfitter even took care of Gianna's rental car, which hinted that we probably wouldn't be coming back. It was intriguing and exciting, and I couldn't wait to see what else she had planned for me. Before leaving, I made one last call to Paul. "Lane, what the hell did you do? All the news here is about Baker's latest failure. Even some of the national services have picked it up." "Damn it, Paul, I have no idea what you're talking about." June's laughter echoed in the background. "Well, his media image is falling like a lead balloon. He can't seem to do anything right. Nothing like this could have happened to a nicer guy. I always wanted to say this. By the way, Lane, divorce is a good move. Emily didn't expect this and it really hurt her. I don't know how you did it, but it seems to work. She has no idea what to do and she has no money." "Paul, believe me, I'm not joking. I have no clue what you're referring to. I never even saw a lawyer. Are you certain about the divorce?" "Yeah, she was shoving it in my face and going off about it just this morning." It was refreshing to finally hear some good news. "By the way, can you stop by the cottage and ask someone to pick up my things and car?" "No problem. Where are you now?" "Moss Bluff, Florida. I'm looking for a trailer to rent." Gianna stood on the dock and waved at me. The canoe was packed to the brim. I silently thanked my parents for insisting I attend Boy Scout camp when I was younger. At least in the canoe, I didn't feel like a complete idiot. We spent the following 6 days exploring the lakes. Each night we set up camp at a new spot. Gianna navigated confidently, using her cell phone GPS to guide us. I was with her, enjoying every moment of the journey. The highlight of the trip was making love under the stars. By noon the next day, our adventure continued. A man greeted us at a small pier on a remote road. He and Gianna embraced and conversed in French. After roughly half an hour, he handed Gianna the keys to the truck and a large envelope. We unloaded our belongings from the canoe and set off down the road. Glancing out the back window, I saw him pushing off from the dock. While I drove, Gianna began sifting through the envelope. "I think I better get used to calling you Clint." Naturally, I gave her a puzzled look. She giggled and handed me a Kennedy and a driver's license with my photo on it. The name on the driver's license read Clinton Stewart. Are we in Canada? Of course, silly. 4 days later, we arrived in New Quay. After another 2 hours, we reached Gianna's family home near Street Hostel. It felt as if I had always belonged there. Despite my initial anxiety about meeting Gianna's family, I felt at ease and content. The mansion was enormous. Gianna's father invited me to join him in his office. An elegant walnut gun cabinet stood against the far wall. I watched with interest as he opened it and pulled out a rifle. Handing it to me with a smile, I realized it was my Marlin 336S with a chamber in it. At that moment, I knew I was home. I never saw or heard from Emily or the girls again. Paul and June received strange Christmas cards every year from Mr. and Mrs. Clinton Stewart. They had no idea. This year, the card will feature a photo of us with our 3 children. I'm sure he'll figure it out. Was there ever really a Zane Baker?